Our next speaker is Jenifer White. Jenifer is one of Historic England's 6 landscape architects. She leads on policy, research and guidance and works closely with colleagues in the regional teams. In her landscaping, planning and conservation career, Jenny has worked for local government and national government agencies. And it also says you're involved in the 1987 Great Storm, which I remember, unfortunately. I was working in Leicester City at those times, and that was quite an experience. So Jenifer, welcome.
Not used to the bright lights. Thank you, everybody. This is going to be a double act. Myself and Erika Petersen, who's my colleague based in the Midlands region. And Alison has asked us to talk a bit about heritage and also our work in the sort of Midlands region. So apologies to those, because I'm very well aware there's lots of expertise in this audience, so you can sit back, relax and just enjoy it as a little bit of revision. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, Historic England is the public body that looks after England's historic environment. We champion places to help all understand, value and care for them. Let's start off looking at how we sort of value our parks. A couple of weeks ago, I got challenged by email about the status of Birkenhead Park in the Wirral and whether it really was the first public park. A good case was actually made for the Manchester parks. But the nub of the problem was that whilst we all understand what a public park is, actually there's no formal definition. And I think Polly touched on this right at the beginning. We usually mean the park is fully and freely open to the public, and also assume that actually they're managed by our local authority. Indeed, 95% of them are managed by local authorities. And through history, we've all inherited an amazing set of assets. And as we've discussed before, we all know that they remain a non-statutory service. And from my point of view, the resourcing, the funding are vague and perhaps inconsistent. Their history and the role of the local authorities is fascinating. It's a history about people, their working lives, and the need for recreation, and also the development of our towns and cities. The earliest municipal parks date from the early 17th century, and an example is Northern Hay in Exeter, which was laid out by the city as a town walk as early as 1612. However, it's not until the 19th century that municipal corporations and the improvement commissions were established under an act in 1835. The new authorities embarked on urgently needed urban improvements, and public parks became an essential part of that urban fabric, an effort to raise living standards as everything else. They took forward the park movement that had been gathering momentum in the previous years, and with the stimulus of further legislation about land donations in the 1860s and 1870s, the number of new public parks substantially increased. By 1880, the number of new parks had more than doubled. And municipal, that term, had become to mean about positive change, and the authorities were proud to invest in these public parks. And I had the opportunity yesterday evening just to catch Colville Park in the sunshine, and it is part of the same story. So the Colville Urban Council history, it was set up in 1894, and soon after, one of their first projects is actually the cemetery opposite the park, and also the public park and which was dedicated in 1899. And this is all very apposite for today, because it was the Public Health Act in 1875 that enabled local authorities to acquire and maintain land for recreation and to raise funds to do so. And I think there's sort of a bit of a myth around that a lot of the parks were gifts, but in fact 3 times as many public parks were actually led by local authorities. They were not donations and such like. With these new powers, the local authorities' confidence grew, and in turn their sense of civic consciousness and pride. And this is very much reflected in the parks that they created, their layouts and their features. At that time, other parks models were explored too, but some research that we did some time ago now shows that over the next 150 years, the local authority model proved the most lasting and the most sustainable model. And indeed, many parks which were run as trusts were actually eventually transferred to local authorities. So municipal, or if you define the word, the local self-government management parks has become very much part of their character. And from my point of view, too often the term public park has been misappropriated for other sites. I think it's a precious term and we should sort of safeguard it. And we've also seen sometimes that public parks being used as commodities to be filled or used for other events or activities by specific groups, which actually they were not designed for. And of course, sadly, some have undergone changes which have been actually detrimental to their historic qualities, design, the vegetation, and general character and other uses. However, the best designs, with care, also have capacity, amazing capacity, to adapt and incorporate change, and have proved to be long-lasting, valuable investments, which are still very relevant today and very much needed. Historic public parks often accrue many values, including social and intangible values to the local and wider communities. And these are recognised internationally in a declaration by ICOMOS. So that the values could include things like aesthetics, about design or character, the horticultural interests and ecological values, their role in moderating climate, and indeed the civic value as places where people met. Perhaps there were events like protests or major gatherings or celebrations. The values held by the community, their meanings and functions, need to be shared, celebrated and safeguarded, and these values often form the core of why parks actually matter to people. So I want to sort of touch upon the formal system that we have for recognising the national interest of public parks. So the National Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest is very much recording the high level historic interests, and the aim of the register is to raise awareness of the significance of the sites on the register. Very few public parks were actually included on the register when it was first published in 1983, between 1983 and 1988. And this primarily reflected a lack of appreciation of the interest and quality of this category of design landscapes. However, during the 1990s, there was very much a review, and knowledge increased rapidly. And we went on to do a number of spot registrations, so more were gradually added to the register. And then the first Select Committee in 1999, the Town and Country Parks Select Committee, actually gave a really stern criticism to the then English Heritage about the fact that the historic and cultural significance of public parks were not recognised, and it prompted a major review. And we then had to set about, how we would actually, what the criteria would be for assessing these sites. So basically the criteria are drawn up in sort of date bands. So the first group are those public parks that were set out between 1833, which is the date of the Select Committee on Public Parks, and 1875, which I already mentioned is the Public Health Act. And these are likely to merit a high grade, particularly where the condition of the park remains good and where the design is of particular note, or there was a design of national importance involved. The second group are the parks developed between 1875 and 1939, and here we will consider them for the register if the landscaping is significant and where the layout survives intact or almost so. And again, these parks would merit a high grade if the design is of particular note or it represents major work of a designer of national importance. And we go further on into time, so we're also looking at parks that were laid out post-1945, but more than 30 years ago. So there's a general rule that for all historic designations that there's a 30-year sort of cut-off date. And obviously the younger the sites are, the more testing the criteria in terms of how they're applied. So by the end of that project, some 100 public parks were added to the register, which actually boosted the whole register by about 7% at the time. And the survey sought to capture the story of the public park development through the date ranges, the different types of funding models, from gifts and subscriptions, and then the emerging new local authorities, the types of drivers for the different public park schemes. So they're very diverse. It could include housing developments, land reclamation, the redevelopment of existing parks and gardens into public parks, seaside and coastal resorts, the new towns, the range of designers that were engaged in public park design, and other stimuli. So there were quite a chunk of new parks that were created or opened to celebrate royal jubilees and coronations, which might be very pertinent in that 2022 is just around the corner. So we're excited to think there's a new park for 2022. To reflect the success of the lotteries funded projects, the grades of the registered parks were reviewed and recalibrated in 2013, and it really is a reflection of the success of those schemes. Some 30 were upgraded at the time. So today there are some 300 public parks and green spaces included on the register. And I think it's just to amplify the points that have been discussed before. So we're not just talking about public parks, but there could also be public gardens, there are town walks, and there are country parks, and there are also over 100 cemeteries and burial grounds that are on the register. And we continue to add to the register. One example is last summer we were able to publish the results of a post-1945 design landscape review, and some more public parks were added, and I've listed some of the examples there. So I think the thing to note is the register is dynamic, it's continuing to grow, and it will also be rolled forward so that the next chapter of landscape design is recorded. and anyone can put forward a site for registration, but you do need to think about making a good case to make sure all those registry criteria are met. And Erika's going to look at the park and garden heritage in the Midlands specifically. So it's estimated that there are some 27,000 public parks in the UK. All those sites have a history, and many more than the 300 that are on the Register of Parks and Gardens are of historic and cultural importance. These parks and green spaces tell the story of urban development right across the country. The parks and the networks of green spaces are as significant as any other public infrastructure, such as roads, sewers, and amenities such as galleries and libraries. And there's something, I think it was in the forum's report of talking about high culture, and I was thinking, well, yes, why aren't our public parks up there regarded equally as high culture? So conservation areas, designations, and listed features such as buildings, gates, railings, and statues, and sometimes scheduled monuments such as castles and earthworks, can be good indicators of the historic significance of a park. So there are other ways that we can actually get that sort of history recorded. Of course, there are numerous smaller and less ornate parks and recreation grounds created from the 1880s onwards into the 20th century that often go unrecognised. And picking up the theme that's very much this morning, health was the driver for creating these new parks, and health continued to be one of the drivers from the 1875 Act onwards, well into the 20th century. After World War I concerns about the health of young people led to the setting up of the National Playing Fields Association, and then in the interwar years we see the creation of the King George V playing fields. The history of public parks is also very much intertwined with the movements to preserve open spaces too, especially commons around towns and cities. And you could even make the link with the setting up of the National Trust. And it goes right on into the 1970s and the 1980s with the setting up of the country parks to provide greater access to the countryside. So one of the challenges for me is the destination systems that we've got are really not set up to reflect this network and this continuum and variety of historic parks and green spaces right from city centres to the countryside, and their cultural importance, offering diverse environments from the formal to the informal. And I think that's one of my key messages for you today, is that Historic England are very keen to work with you, but the very important role local authority colleagues have in actually bringing out this historic and cultural importance. And I think there's a big role for the green infrastructure strategies that are being developed. So in 2022, we'll see the green infrastructure standards published as part of the government's 25-year environment plan. To date, much of the green infrastructure discussion has focused on new features, and I sign up very readily that these are very much needed. However, the point that I want to make is that since World War II, the opportunities to create large public parks have really been very few and far between. One of the exceptions and notable examples was the 226-hectare Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and in contrast, Manchester is rightly proud of the new Mayfield Park in Manchester, but it will only be 6.5 hectares. The average for registered parks and gardens developed before 1945 was actually 35 hectares, and some of the oldest examples are much, much bigger, and the glorious one for Birmingham is Sutton Park, which is immense. It's 900 hectares. And I think, whilst we are creating some new green spaces, a lot of these are actually tied to housing developments and actually very, very small scale. So our historic parks and green spaces are therefore the major features of the green infrastructure network. I mean, let's remember, they were created as places to enjoy the open air, the beauty of flowers and trees, and to feel refreshed, to socialise, and to take part in both active and quiet recreation. These parks were seen as the lungs of the city, and they offered many sort of attributes to sort of achieve that. And one of them definitely was to counter the effects of pollution in the towns. And today we know that the parks have an increasingly important role in helping to moderate climate impacts, and that's very diverse, everything from from pollution to flooding. And Drew made the point, of course, they are great habitats too, and they can be, potentially with careful design and management, these biodiversity values can be enhanced. And from a sort of looking at the historic value point of view, the original tree planting and the pallets of trees and shrubs, often exotic ones, and plant borders are all important as part of that character, and they can also contribute to the biodiversity. It is vital that the historic and cultural value of parks are woven into the new green infrastructure objectives, and we need to make sure that the standards support the conservation and maintenance of these parks so they achieve their full potential as green infrastructure. And one of the examples of things that we've been doing is that we've been working with Green Flag for a long time now on green heritage accreditation, which was a way of trying to raise awareness about those heritage values. And Paul Todd will be talking about Green Flag shortly. So DCMS is now working on developing a cultural and heritage capital valuation framework to aid decisions on policies, programmes and projects. And obviously public parks are going to be part of this. The framework will provide a parallel to natural capital counting. And we've got an interesting mix here of bringing those sort of two together. So Drew's already sort of mentioned this. In 2017, the Lottery Fund with the Greater London Authority and the National Trust published a natural capital count for London's green spaces, and they were able to show for each £1 spent by local authorities and their partners on public parks, the Londoners enjoyed at least £27 in value, although the benefits were not evenly spread across the capital. This year, in 2020, last year, Vivid Economics and Barton Millmore launched a more comprehensive evaluation tool, and we commissioned them to use this Greenkeeper tool to analyse the socio-economic benefits for the 72 public parks that are in the 8 core cities. And these results very much echo the 2007 findings, but the first time we can actually show you the values of historic public parks. So we've got 37 million visits yearly. That's works out as 500,000 plus visits per park, and there are over 846 million in annual benefits. including physical health, mental well-being, amenity value and carbon sequestration, and that works out at 1.75 million benefits per park. And mental health benefits are way at the highest, providing equivalent to £543 million yearly. And the core city for the Midlands that was in this group was Birmingham, which has the highest number of historic public parks out of that group of 8. These parks account for 168 million annual benefits. So an interesting challenge for me is that clearly the health and wellbeing benefits so far outweigh carbon sequestration and other amenity values, and I think that's probably because we actually haven't quite sort of found a way to really analyse and explore those better. And I think it'd be really interesting whether we could come back at some point and actually show that actually we could improve the carbon sequestration values just through site management. So the last slide. So the public, that's the Birmingham slide. So the public parks sector continues to call for parks to be managed as essential infrastructure, and many organisations and academics have submitted evidence to the current House of Lords COVID-19 Select Committee on the impact of the pandemic on towns and cities. The disproportionate reductions in green space funding have been stressed by everybody, and the issue about improving quality and accessibility of our public parks the need to address the quality and accessibility of our public parks. And Historic England very much supports the sector in these calls. And in our own evidence, the 3 things that we stressed was the need for better protection and safeguarding of our public parks, recognition in statute, policy and financing, so that parks are seen and green spaces are seen as critical infrastructure, an acceleration of action and support for local green space strategies that recognises the value of existing green spaces, including their cultural as well as natural heritage. And finally, we'd like to close with just to say the forum's new 6 case studies are very, very welcome in helping to make this case. Thank you.